Okay, chapter 26. The Cold War. It became clear, every book says, that the United States and Soviet Union interpreted the Yalta Agreement differently. The West believed that free elections would bring about permanent peace. Communism has hardly ever had a free election. Now, there have been a few. For a time, we'd say the communists never won a fair election. But in Chile, the communists won there, and it was a fair election. The communist government there only lasted about 3 or 4 years. But nevertheless, most of the elections that were held under communism were not fair in the sense that we would call fair. Communist governments, the communists took over Eastern Europe, and communists got a third of Eastern Europe. A lot of persons, particularly General Patton, wanted to fight the Russians right away, but no one else seemed to want to fight after World War II. So the Soviet Union got their way, pretty much. Stalin got his way. Now, one of the first acts that Stalin did was to blockade Berlin, hoping that the rest of the country would capitulate. So he did not allow supplies to get in from West Germany into West Berlin. Well, the West Germans and the United States, Britain, and France airlifted aid into Berlin in what was called the Berlin Airlift. The Berlin Airlift was the first conflict between the United States and Soviet Union. And it was to be the first of many, where the Soviet Union was on one side, the United States on another. For the next 45 years, in almost every conflict, every crisis, the Soviet Union was on the opposite side, and we were on our side. Anyway, the Berlin Airlift airlifted thousands of tons of aid into Berlin. And finally, the Russians saw that they could not stop, they could not starve Berlin out. So the Russians lifted the blockade and allowed trucks and trains to move into Berlin once again. Conflict number one between the West and the Soviet Union. Conflict number one went to the West. The Soviet Union lost the Berlin conflict. But now I'm not going to say the Soviet Union was always losing. Soviet Union was to win many of the conflicts from there on out. But Berlin Airlift was the one they didn't win. Berlin was to remain a trouble spot for many years. Eventually, the Soviet Union built the Berlin Wall. Now, see if you can catch a mistake I'm going to make on purpose, real close. The Berlin Wall was put up there to keep Westerners out of that communistic heaven that the Soviets had created. Anybody hear it? What I just said?
Can you repeat what you just said?
What I just said was wrong. The Berlin Wall was put up, the Berlin Wall was put up to keep Westerners out of that communistic heaven that had been created in East Berlin. No. The Berlin Wall was put up to keep Easterners from leaving and going into a better life in the West. Yeah, it wasn't put up to keep people out of that communistic heaven, which, by the way, was not a heaven at all. But anyway, Berlin Wall put up, and it lasted for many years. And Ronald Reagan later on was to go to Berlin and tell Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall. By the time it was torn down, Ronald Reagan was suffering from Alzheimer's. But nevertheless, the Berlin Wall did eventually come down. Germany was eventually reunited and Berlin became one city again. The West Germans moved their capital from Berlin to Hamburg, and today I'm not sure if Berlin is the capital of Hamburg, is the capital of Germany. Anybody know? I don't know. But anyway, Berlin ceased to be the capital at that point.
Is Frankfurt the capital?
What?
Frankfurt?
You might be right. You know, I don't know anymore. I should know this, I guess. I don't know.
It's Berlin.
Um,
Yeah.
Now, what's that?
It's Berlin.
It's Berlin? Okay, Berlin again, all right. Now, in 1949, the year I was born, Western nations formed NATO, North Atlantic Treaty Organization, and this was what we had promised we'd not do after World War I. We had told ourselves that we would not have secret alliances or secret. Well, NATO is not a secret alliance, but NATO is nations. Well, the nations involved is the United States, Canada, and then Britain and France, and I believe the Scandinavian countries: Norway, Sweden, Finland, and Denmark, and Turkey is involved. Even Turkey is a member of NATO. These nations were formed to be allies to each other to stop communists. Now, folk, there's a real sinister thing about NATO. Well, okay. European countries having defeated fascism, and the word S in fascism is socialist. Nazism, the Z in Nazi stands for socialist. Having defeated socialism, once the war was over, they could not wait to embrace socialism. Great Britain did, France did. I mean, they just whipped it, but they said, oh, the reason socialism hasn't worked so far, it's been run by men, evil men like Stalin, evil men like Mussolini, evil men, but you get some good men running it, it'll work. So Great Britain in particular appointed 3 of the most morally upright men who ever lived to lead Britain into a socialistic state. Now, I'm going to tell you ahead of time what you all know I'm about to say. It did not work. France tried socialism, it didn't work either. Now, what system have to do with NATO? Your Scandinavian countries, and this is true especially of countries like Sweden and Finland, do not have much of an army anymore because they're depending on NATO to fight for them, and particularly they're depending on the United States. Essentially, European countries are depending on the United States to fight for them if a war breaks out. Where did their money go? To feed their poor people. They also realized they could not feed all their colonies, so these nations, particularly Britain and France, began to free their colonies one at a time. Jamaica in 1960, and for all practical purposes, Canada and Australia are now free. India was turned loose in 1947, I believe. And the Middle East, Great Britain got rid of the Middle East about that same time. But these countries still do not have much of an army. And folk, they would be of no help to us if we got involved in a war. Britain has an army still, France does, but a lot of the rest of Europe, or Germany does. Oh yes, Germany was allowed to rearm after 1955. Well, in the meantime, to combat NATO, the other nations of the Iron Curtain countries formed the Warsaw Pact. The Warsaw Pact nations they were, I mean, Warsaw was a capital of Poland. They consist of Poland, Yugoslavia, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, and East Germany. Those Iron Curtain countries. The Iron Curtain countries formed the Warsaw Pact nations. So you had NATO versus the Warsaw Pact, a bunch of secret alliances, but they never really came to blows, at least haven't to this point. Today, Eastern Europe is no longer under communism, and Russia is no longer a superpower. But for the next 45 years, it was like Western Europe didn't matter so much on the world scene. It was the United States and Soviet Union, 2 superpowers. Now today, there are still 2 superpowers, but they are the United States and China. Russia is only, and the Soviet Union is only half of what it once was. Well, I put it this way, Russia is only half of what the Soviet Union once was. All right. Each side, both the Warsaw Pact countries and the NATO countries accused the other of trying to spread its ideology. The Soviet Union accused the United States of trying to spread its brand of capitalism and democracy, which they said encouraged greed. And NATO and its allies accused Russia of trying to spread communism. And each side accused the other of trying to take over the world. And actually both may have been one as guilty as the other. Most Western historians at first blamed the Soviet Union for starting the Cold War, but today you have more liberal historians who spread the blame out, scatter the blame between both sides. There's no doubt, and your book says there's no doubt that communism was determined to expand. No doubt that Western leaders were justified in trying to stop the threat. But your book says the West might have overreacted. The result was an arms race. An arms race and new weapons of destruction. All right, the United States at this time was the only country that had the atomic bomb. That was to change very quickly. Now, in Asia, start with Asia. Stalin had promised that at the Yalta Conference that he would not aid the Chinese communists led by Mao Zedong. All of us know what that promise actually meant. Three on Hitler's promises, three on Stalin's promises. They meant nothing to hardly anybody. Anyway, the Soviet Union did help Mao Zedong. And in 1949, Mao Zedong won. The Chinese communists took over China and still have it to this day. Chiang Kai-shek had not fought hard against Japan because he was actually preparing to fight the communists. The communists were building up their strength. A lot of Westerners admired the communists, believing communism was the solution to the world's problems. This is an untidiness people have. Way back in ancient Greece, a philosopher named Socrates. Socrates was an Athenian, and yet he admired the enemy, the Spartans, believing the Spartans had a better system. A lot of college professors used to admire the Soviet Union. And yes, I had a professor at UT, Paul Pinckney by name, who was an admitted communist. And he was an admirer. And every time the United States and the Soviet Union clashed, or every time the United States and China clashed, he could be counted on to take China's point of view with the Soviet Union. He always sided with the communists against his own country. We have had a lot of Westerners. And one communist woman who was teaching at American college wrote a book on how wonderful things were in the Soviet Union in 1989. By 1990, the Soviet Union was dead, collapsed under its own weight. But anyway, a lot of Westerners admired the communists. The Chinese attempted to form a coalition government that would involve both communists and Western, the Chiang Kai-shek and Mao's group. The Civil War, the experiment failed. A civil war broke out in China. The communists received help from the Soviet Union. Chiang Kai-shek received no help from the West. A lot of Chiang's supporters defected to Mao's communists. So Chiang Kai-shek and 2 million men, 2 million followers, fled to Taiwan, the island off the coast of China, otherwise known as Formosa, otherwise known as the Republic of China. Now, this is still going on, folk. The Chinese claim that they own Formosa, and they have threatened, and they are building up islands. I mean, yes, actually filling in shallow areas of the sea to build up islands in an attempt to take Formosa back. And they could strike at any time, folk, and nobody knows what the United States would do if they did. Supposedly, because of the treaty, we should go to war and try to stop the Chinese, but whether we'd actually do it or not, I don't know. But the Chinese can strike Formosa anytime and take back what they claim is their land. Anyway, Chiang Kai-shek fled to Taiwan. He and his 2 million followers have now all died of old age. the land of Taiwan is now half Chinese and half local Taiwanese. President Truman blamed Chiang Kai-shek for the communist takeover. Chiang Kai-shek blamed Harry Truman, etc., etc. Now, Korea. When the peace treaty was made, Korea was divided between the Soviet Union and the United States, with the Soviet Union taking the north part and the United States taking the south. North Korea had the best of the farmland. South Korea had the crummiest of the land. Anyway, the dividing line was the 38th parallel. If you look on the map, the 38th parallel pretty much divides Korea into two even halves. Well, Korea was promised self-determination and self-government, but as relations between the United States and Soviet Union deteriorated, neither side dared give Korea the vote. Self-determination was denied Korea. Well, the Soviet Union told North Korea, invade South Korea, we're sure that the United States won't fight. Okay, I read a book about the Korean War, and the Korean War was caused in part because the North Koreans did not believe the United States would go to war. So North Korea invaded South Korea in 1950. And to the surprise of the North Koreans, the United States ordered General Douglas MacArthur to leave Japan and go and defend South Korea, which he did. Now, if you look at the Korean War in detail, the Korean War went back and forth. At one point, the North Koreans held 90%, but then the United States sent in more troops and armaments. It went back and forth. And then China got involved. And at that point, we realized we better make peace. Truman's term of office ran out into his second term, and Eisenhower was elected, and Eisenhower promised to end the fighting. Eisenhower said it's the wrong war in the wrong place with the wrong enemy at the wrong time. We don't want to fight over Korea. So, Eisenhower worked out a truce. Now, the Korean War, folk, and this is something I learned a few years ago, never really ended. All they did was the two sides agreed to stop fighting and form what you call a truce. But officially the war is still going on. And every once in a while, North Korea will shoot some weapons, artillery at South Korea, kill a few South Koreans, and the South Koreans have taken it. And this has been going on for, 69 years or so, or 68 years since the truce was signed. Korea still makes news. Now, earlier I said Korea got the best of farmland. That's true. But South Korea realized they could not farm their bad land. They industrialized. They copied Japan. They built factories. They built industries. They sold their goods abroad. Two cars they make, the Hyundai and the Kia, now made by the same company. I've owned 3 Kias in my time. Still own one. The other 2 wore out. Anyway, I kept them a long time though. Hyundai, good car, but a copy of Japan's Honda. Anyway, now, South Korea is prospering. North Korea is starving. And the North Koreans blame all their problems on the United States. That's a surefire way to guarantee they'll never solve them. The real problem is communism, which has not worked where it's been tried. North Korea has been guilty of abuses. Both sides. And North Korea has recently taken on to firing missiles and supposedly working on developing nuclear weapons. The United States doesn't want them to, and the result is a stalemate that is still going on, and nobody knows the outcome. Some of you may know the North Korean president recently crossed into South Korea legally, and the South Korean president crossed into North Korea legally. Supposedly the two sides are trying to work out their differences and become united. And South Korea has sometimes given aid to the poor, starving North Koreans. food in the way of food and other medical supplies. It has not led to peace. All right. The Korean War is still going on. It ended in something of a stalemate. It ended when Eisenhower got the Soviet Union and the North Koreans and Chinese to work up a peace treaty. All right, now, Southeast Asia, or you might say Vietnam, Indochina. It's on the old maps, it's called French Indochina. When World War II was over, the French returned to Indochina, or in other words, to Vietnam. But Ho Chi Minh was determined to drive the French out. So he got together a bunch of men, and they fought against the French. And to make a long story short, they defeated the French. The French were in no mood to fight a war on the other side of the globe, 10,000 miles away, which would have been an expensive war. And Ho Chi Minh said, you can kill our men at a ratio of 10 to 1, 10 of ours to 1 of yours. But we have enough men, we'll keep coming back. And that's what the United States did, killed them at a ratio of 10 to 1, but they kept coming back. Well, the French pulled out. In 1954, after losing the battle, the French pulled out. Eisenhower would not go into Vietnam for the same reason he didn't stay in Korea. He said the wrong war, the wrong place, the wrong time. But the next president after him, Kennedy, began to make inroads into Vietnam, and then Johnson really got us involved in Vietnam, and we remained involved in Vietnam for many, many years. Vietnam was divided into two countries, North and South, just like Korea. But there was a difference. In the case of the South Koreans, we succeeded in westernizing them. South Korea is the most Christian country on the face of the earth. Half of the South Koreans are Christian, half are Buddhist. And on any given Sunday, higher percentage of Christians attend church in South Korea than anywhere else in the world, even here in the Bible Belt. So South Koreans were westernized, the Vietnamese were not. Half of your South Vietnamese were for the North, and all your North Vietnamese were on one side, which meant basically that Vietnam was 3/4 communist, and there was nothing the United States could do about that. We'll have more to say about the Vietnam War later, the United States part in it. All right. Back to the Soviet Union. Stalin died. The next man to take over was Khrushchev. Most of you probably have not heard much about Khrushchev. If you had grown up when I did, you would have. Khrushchev was to govern Russia for the Soviet Union for 12 years. From the time I was 4 years old until the time I was 15, inclusive, that's 12 years. And when I was a kid, my classmates would say to other young girls to each other, you like Nikita Khrushchev. Keep in mind, Nikita Khrushchev was a warty old fraud. With all respect, of course. I'm almost as old as he is. But, and also the girls, when somebody would accuse a girl, you like so-and-so, and she'd say, that is pure propaganda, because we called it the Soviet news propaganda. Contained a little bit of truth, maybe half truth, but otherwise it was a lie. Anyway, Khrushchev took over. He was to govern. Khrushchev surprised the world when he made a scathing speech denouncing Stalin. He ran Stalin to the ground. Stalin's daughter defected to the West, by the way, and I think by now she's probably died of old age. But he had a daughter who to leave the Soviet Union and come to the West and take up residence in the West. Now, Khrushchev paid visits to the United States and he met President Eisenhower. Khrushchev tried to give what we call coexistence, or peaceful coexistence. But there were times when Khrushchev stood firm with the West. Now, every time a trouble spot happened in the world, whether it be Berlin, or Lebanon, or Israel, or the Suez, Everywhere there was a trouble spot, the Soviets always took one side and we took another. This was remained true during the time I was in elementary school, high school, and college. And by the way, from here on out, a lot of the stuff I'm teaching is stuff that I remember from when I was a kid, from here on out. I don't remember Khrushchev coming to power, but he was in power for a few years before I began to realize what was going on in the world. But anyway, he maintained what he called peaceful coexistence, but there was a time when he, well, more than once, he stood firm against the West. Now, the first historical event I remember was Hungary. In 1956, Hungary revolted. Hungary believed that if they rebelled against the Soviet Union, that the West would come to their aid. Eisenhower, who was the leader of the free world, said, we just can't risk nuclear war. Hungary was not helped. The Soviet troops moved in under Khrushchev, and they crushed the Hungarian rebellion. This is when Dad explained to me that the Soviet Union was huge, was large, was bigger than we were, and I pictured the Soviet Union as being the big bully on the block whom nobody could handle. And the United States lost with Hungary. All told, the three countries will rebel against the Soviet Union: Hungary, Czechoslovakia in 1968, and Poland in 1980. Hungary in 1956, Czechoslovakia in 68, Poland in 80. But the time came when all three of those countries told the Soviet Union, go home. And the Soviet Union left them. The Soviet Union started splitting apart, but that's a subject for a later chapter, for later on. Khrushchev used to pay visits to the United States and met with Eisenhower. Then later Khrushchev was to meet with President Kennedy and even President Johnson. What I remember about the news at the time, and as my family listened to the news on the radio, it was crisis after crisis. A crisis would occur in the Suez. After a while, that one would settle. Then another one would pop up in the Congo. After a while, that one would settle. Another one would pop up in Lebanon. After a while, that would settle. Then a crisis would pop up in Berlin. It was just one after another, going in cycles. And for a while, all that we talked about might be Berlin, Berlin, Berlin. Then Berlin would die down for a while, and another one would pop up. And I remember when Vietnam became a crisis. This one was settled in a few months. No, when Vietnam came, it was this last 12 years. The poor countries, the African nations that were gaining their independence, were often called the Third World. Countries like Chad and Libya, Third World countries. The Soviets did everything they could to try to convince these countries that, hey, we're your buddy, we're your friend, we're on your side. So the peaceful coexistence was shaky. Now, the Cuban Missile Crisis. All right, backing up a little bit. In 1960, we elected the young John Kennedy. John Kennedy was younger than Khrushchev's youngest son, and Khrushchev did not respect him much. Khrushchev told Kennedy that he said, the Soviet Union will help any country that's trying to be liberated from democracy, liberated from your poison of democracy and your poison of capitalism. The United States will stand with them. Kennedy was determined to take a firmer stand against the Soviet Union. So, Kennedy's first move occurred within, let's see, 3 months after inauguration, called the Bay of Pigs. The communists had taken over Cuba. You may know Cuba is just 90 miles off Florida shores. It was the first communist country in the Western Hemisphere. It was like, whoops, we've lost again. When I was young, the United States was losing round after round after round against the Soviets, including losing to Cuba. Fidel Castro had taken over, and Kennedy was determined to get it back. So a bunch of Cubans around the Miami area in Florida trained, and they were sent back with a firm promise from President Kennedy that we will back you up with air support. The troops got in their boats and went to the Bay of Pigs, expecting Kennedy to send bombers in, fighter planes. And guess what? Some of you know, Kennedy did not. Got cold feet. Now, folks, this idea of presidents getting cold feet